Keep in mind, this is accessible information for anyone to get their hands on and cross-reference. Study deeper and verify and check sources for further research. I leave out some of the more complex layers of Eurocentric perspectives of economy, religion, and politics unless it relates to African prisoners of war and the African perspective of the transatlantic slave trade. For 12,000 years, Virginia was home to about 12 main tribes before European occupation. The British almost didn't make it through their first 12 years there. The Powhatan put up with bullying for a short while before massacring settlers and refusing to trade with them in the early 1600s. The settlers' suffering, however, didn't come at the hands of the Powhatan and surrounding tribes only. The ruthlessness of European leadership was killing settlers in droves. They were denied access to adequate food, clothing, and shelter, and when they went to the tribes for help, most of them were killed. The colonist leader during that period was Sir Thomas Smith, who now has statues in his honor erected all over England. And from 1609 to 1620, he restricted meals to the equivalent of half a water bottle of flour and a bowl of molded, maggot-filled peas as the daily allowance for settlers. His people's housing were holes dug into the ground. They ate their own fecal matter, the fecal matter of their neighbors. They dug up graves to eat the corpses and killed their spouses while they slept to eat them too, just so they wouldn't starve to death while Smith made himself rich at their expense. They refused to learn to work the land themselves because they knew they had some people coming to do it for them. Britain already had an agenda to expand wealth through occupation in the New World. They planned to have the fertile land worked and harvested, and they knew exactly who they needed to get it done. Right before the population of settlers completely wiped themselves out, African slaves were imported to build homes, cultivate crops, and otherwise help the miserable Europeans out of their own excrement, literally speaking. When they first arrived, they still held many of their traditions, cultural customs, and ways of healing brought from the West Indies or directly from Africa. But the same brutal treatment offered to the native tribes was exponential when it came to African captives. The Europeans were met with much resistance, but because Africans were in a foreign land under the threat and reality of constant terrorism, their resistance took on more subversive forms. Ritual poisoning began on the slave ships and continued even into arrival in the colonies. Once here, they used drums to communicate with one another, gained knowledge of roots and herbs to make poisons, and gathered together to plot on ways to murder their captors and their captors' families to gain freedom. It took Europeans almost 30 years to catch on to the fact that through healing tradition and conjure magic, they were under the constant threat and reality of mutiny and revolution. The French were the first to enact laws to keep Africans in America and throughout the diaspora from using healing or conjure modalities to create community and gain freedom. This period of conjure and root work banning spanned over a period of over 100 years, starting with France's Codes Noires in 1678 and going past the Haitian Revolution in 1791. Drums were banned, fire was banned, gathering was banned, healing was banned. No roots, no plants, no herbs, no dirt, no iron nails, no fingernails, no hair, no snakeskin, no lizards, no spiders, no drums, no fire, no gathering, no healing. The first laws against Africans practicing their ways of life started with the banning of drums. Kalinda gatherings in English-occupied Barbados included ritual practice that included drums, dancing, and chanting used to invoke not only spirit possession, but protection, call for revolution, and community cohesion. In Martinique, the first French colony in the Caribbean, dancing and gathering of Negroes were forbidden. The Kalinda and similar rituals in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish-occupied colonies and settlements were outlawed across the islands altogether in 1678 by local ordinance, and in 1685 King Louis XIV had Code Noir enacted all across the French colonies from the islands to the continental U.S. to include Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi. These black codes banned gatherings, forbade all religions except Roman Catholicism, said slaves couldn't marry without their owner's consent, slaves belonging to different masters can't gather at any time, specified the slave or free status of children born of free enslaved parents, justified capital punishment for violating these laws, and ordered all Jews out of the French colonies. Code Noir was drafted by a French military tactician named Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who is still hailed as a brilliant mind in military strategy and has statues erected all over France in his honor. His policies heavily influenced American President Alexander Hamilton. He died before completing his codes, based on many years of observing African culture in the French colonies. His son completed the codes and turned them in to King Louis XIV for ratification. They were rejected by the Parliament but still found home in Haiti and Martinique in 1687, in Guyana in 1704, and in Louisiana and the American colonies in 1724. The second version of the codes were passed by 13-year-old Louis XV in 1724. Every so often, new laws would be drafted to prevent any and all kinds of gatherings of Africans and their use of plants, and these laws were mostly based on a justified fear of slave revolt and insurrection, specifically of a magical nature. In the English colony of Jamaica, the Slave Code of 1696 enforced capital punishment on slaves for drumming, spiritual work, and especially from carrying what they termed poison, which constituted any plant material, whether it was leaves, roots, powders, or stems, on their person. In Bermuda, several slaves were tried for poisoning just 34 years later. In Virginia, poisoning was the second most frequent crime for which enslaved people were prosecuted around that same time. Captives were forbidden from administering plants for healing purposes, and ritual spiritual work was out of the question. In Bermuda in 1755, a man named Polybus was prosecuted for concealing what they referred to as poison in the ground in the form of liquor, nails, hair, and herbs. Because the court could not prove that he was using the poison to inflict harm on anyone, he was acquitted. But Bermuda quickly closed this loophole. 9 years later, in the Act for the Better Government of Negroes, it stated that, and whereas it is a general notion among Negroes and other slaves that persons' lives may be affected by certain compositions being laid and well placed in the houses, beds, and other places where white people dwell and reside, and whereas such may not actually be found to be of a poisonous nature, yet as they are laid with an intent to affect some person or persons, it ought to be esteemed highly criminal in the doer or doers thereof. In a British newspaper called the Bristol Weekly Intelligencer, their March 3, 1750 issue included a recipe for an antidote to slave poison. It was printed and spread all over Great Britain and through the colonies. In 1757, the French discovered how real those spiritual weapons are when Macandal strategized an island-wide rebellion that left over 6,000 livestock, slave owners, and slaves dead. His plan included poisoning the water supply in the city of Le Cap, but it was much broader than that. Through the use of macandals, or what the hoodoo tradition would call mojo bags or hands, he called on spiritual sources to lead and make successful his attack. He was arrested and burned to death, historians say, in 1758. However, folklore tells that he didn't die but escaped after turning into a gnat or a mosquito. He provided leadership that was both political and spiritual, and coordinated a well-plotted attack that initiated fear of conjure culture for centuries after. Soon after his murder, a judge described Saint-Domingue, or Haiti in the Dominican Republic island, as swarming with slaves, so-called soothsayers and sorcerers who poison. The Le Cap Council made it illegal to carry macandals, engage in superstitious ceremonies and assemblies, or to make and sell drugs for any purpose. Our use of herbs was predicated on their power to influence spiritual or physical healing and protection. One colonist wrote nearly 20 years after Macandal's murder that it wasn't necessary for Africans who were enslaved to actually place poisonous herbs into the food of whites. It was enough for them to do their lethal work by making an arrangement of those herbs near the bed or next to the door of the apartment of a person or persons whose life they wanted to take. This shows that a whole generation after the rebellion was over, European fear was still at an all-time high. In 1760, 2 years after Macandal's War, Jamaica's largest uprising took place. Led by Obia priest Takye, an island-wide network of rebels were able to take control of much of the island in what later became known as Takye's Rebellion. Even though the British took out many of their leaders, they weren't able to completely kill the rebellion. Rebel camps continued to exist for months in the hills of West Jamaica, but they and Takye were killed by Maroons, or the overseer class of Africans working on behalf of Britain. Takye was an oracle, a chief spiritual leader of his people when he led them to battle. A colonist named Brian Edwards wrote of the rebellion. Takye was an old Coromantun Negro, the chief instigator and oracle of the insurgents in the parish, who administered the fetishes and solemn oath to the conspirators, and furnished them with a magical preparation which was to render them invulnerable. Obia was viewed from that point on as a resistant cultural practice that had the ability to topple white supremacy. At this point, anti-Obia laws were passed that prohibited drumming, the gathering of enslaved Africans, and put pressure on Europeans to convert them to Christianity by force. The Obia man motif became popular in British theater, novels, and poems. In 1763, slaves in Guyana were led into a 2-year independence by Cuffy, a cooper or barrel maker in what is known as the Great Rebellion. The rebellion began on the plantation he was being held at, and he and his army killed the slave master and his family and burned their house and fields to the ground. They swept across the state, killing slave masters and burning houses, destroying everything except supplies in their path. In what would become the United States, our access to the root and conjure knowledge was systematically removed from our culture, similar to the Caribbean nations. Early rebellions and resistance also included use of herbs and roots to poison, but as time went on, we opted for more physical resistance options to respond to our conditions. At midnight on April 6, 1712, about 40 captives gathered together at some forgotten square in New York City. Guns, knives, hatchets, and swords in hand, they rushed the town, reportedly killing 9 people and injuring 6. When they were about to be captured, 6 of them committed suicide and the rest were killed by being burned alive, hung, or broken with wheels. This rebellion was snuffed out quickly, but European fears of black violence rose. Law now allowed for slave owners to punish their captives at their discretion and made it harder to release Africans from bondage. About 30 years later, slaves were accused of setting planned fires in New York City in what is still called the Negro Plot of 1741. Poor Europeans were angry because Africans were taking their jobs. Artisans and craftsmen would train slaves to do their jobs at a significantly decreased rate, putting many smaller operations out of business. Slaves comprised the majority of the population in New York City, and tensions were also rising between the Catholic Spanish and the Protestant British Europeans, adding fuel to the already tense European fire. That year, a series of suspicious wildfires had been set to government buildings, starting with the mayor's house at Fort George, Manhattan. Then fires started popping up at cow stables and warehouses. One night, a European man saw a house on fire and a black man running away from the scene and shouted, "The niggers are rising." An African named Kofi was the one accused of setting fire, and when the townspeople tried to put it out, slaves attacked and killed many of them. While no one knew who was responsible for all those random fires, those slaves who attacked the townspeople during Kofi's fire were tried and executed for all of them. At this time, the gathering of slaves on corners was prohibited, and only 12 at a time could gather for a funeral, among other restrictions imposed. Just a year earlier and around that same time, South Carolina implemented the Negro Act of 1740 and the Security Act to respond to Cato's rebellion, where an African enslaved man from Congo gathered about 20 men together on Sunday, September 9th, 1739. They gathered arms and set out for Spanish Florida, where escaped slaves were granted asylum. They marched down the road with a sign that read Liberty, chanting the word in unison. As they marched, they gathered about 100 followers and burned 6 plantations and killed about 30 European men, women, and children on their way. The Negro Act restricted gatherings, growing food, moving abroad, earning money, and learning how to read. The Security Act required that all white men carry firearms to church on Sundays, a day that was designated for freedom amongst the slaves, as free as they could be, and a separation between slave owners and enslaved Africans. European history states that Cato or Jimmy's army didn't make it to their destination and they were killed by white militia. Due to their affinity for revising history, we may never know what really happened to any or many of those who fought against chattel slavery. The later, more popular insurrections, like Telemaque and Gullah Jack in 1822 or Nat Turner in 1831, illustrate a merge of physical and spiritual resistance that had the same determination and purpose as the centuries prior in Haiti, Martinique, and other places where African resistance to white supremacy thrived. This timeline shows how the earlier, more successful rebellions relied heavily on the use of nature and spirit in order to achieve an end. In Haiti, African captives understood the lay of the land. They tried and tested every part of the plant and used them in every way possible. It was this resistance and revolution through conjure and root work in the earlier decades of the transatlantic slave trade that gives a foundation to build a current revolution from. Studying the tactical prowess of Telemaque, or Denmark Vesey as he's popularly known, and the spiritual strength of Gullah Jack, the knowledge and leadership of Makandal, the force of Take, the determination of Cato, gives us an arsenal of information to build systems of resistance for the betterment of our people. Not just building arguments and followings based on rhetoric of resistance, but actual, tangible, working, effective systems of resistance. I implore everyone to go watch the movie Quilombo, spelled Quilombo, about a resistance camp in Brazil. And to read, I'm going to recommend 3 books that I got most of this information from, as well as some sources online. But these 3 books are great foundations to start with to understand what I just discussed. And they are Witchcraft, Poison, Law, and Atlantic Slavery by Diana Payton, Slave Rebellions by Robin Santos Doak and Philip Schwartz, and Medical Revolutionaries, The Enslaved Healers of the 18th Century Saint-Domingue by Carol K. Weaver. And I'll post those names in the description below. Peace.